Happy Father's Day. Children are dismissed to go to class. In fact, because it's Father's Day, we're going to take a break from our study that I've been doing on the parables this week and look instead at a story that takes place in a passage that's found in the 5th chapter of Luke's Gospel. If you want to turn there, we'll be there in just a minute. But before we look at that, I wanted to read you some statistics. Not to discourage you, but to actually encourage us, especially us men, about the mission that God has given us. But you know, this Father's Day, in our society, we live in a nation where approximately 18.2 million children in the United States are living in a home without a biological step or adoptive father present. That means they're living without his protection, without his leadership guidance, without his masculine influence that God created to be imparted to children, just as he created the feminine influence to be imparted. And in case you're wondering, to put that in simpler terms, that means that that's 1 in 4 kids in America that live in a father-absent household. And there's many reasons for this in our culture. And I'm not going to cover them all, but one of the biggest ones is, and that's kind of the point of what I want to talk about today, is that a lot of men, for one reason or another, have just given up. In fact, we live in a society today that believes quitting sometimes should be the first option when things get tough. And to some extent, that feeling, I guess I can understand. I don't like it when things get difficult or feel pointless either. And often, there's something in the back of my mind that would rather just quit something, not do it, rather than fight for it if I don't think I'm going to succeed anyways. And I think that comes from an inner feeling that, a lot of men and women have, that no matter what we do, it's just not going to be good enough anyway. And I also think that thought is far more common than we realize, because that's the message that our society really slings at men today, that they're not good enough, so just go away. Instead of encouraging them to do better, we just kind of tear them down further, and so they often do just quit. But my point is nobody benefits from that. And this feeling of inadequacy or discouragement that sometimes leads some men to sometimes rather give up than fight, it can be so strong in us sometimes that, I myself, there's a poem I keep in the front of my Bible I had taped in there that I read sometimes. It's a reminder that quitting isn't an option, because there are things worth fighting for. In fact, it's entitled A Quitter. This is what it says. It's just a short little poem. It says, "Out of what kind of stuff is a quitter made? It's lack of interest, or I'm afraid, a love of change or desire for ease, chasing will-o'-the-wisp on a summer breeze. He lacks the courage to do or to dare if the road to the prize is not smooth and fair. He has not the will to see it through when he knows it's the work that he should do. A quitter's not willing to work and wait for better things, be it soon or late, nor will he prove by his work each day that he is worthy of better pay. And day by day as he goes along, he's not conscious of what is wrong. He wants a job with nothing to do, to be a great man and an idler too. And as the days and years go by, calamity at his plaintive cry. He fails to see why his life is bitter or why he is labeled as a quitter." You see, that reminds me that sometimes you got to go through some hard things to get to the other side, to accomplish the goal, to not quit. You see, as I said earlier, nobody benefits when men specifically give up. Everybody loses, because God created us for a reason. And that is why we need to encourage others to persevere, and instead of tearing people down, reminding them instead of what they're called to be and what they're fighting for. Now, I want you to think about that as we move along today. And getting back to our text, just how last week we examined the call from Jesus towards Matthew, who was a tax collector. Today we're going to look at the call from Christ to Peter, and also Peter's reaction to that. And although we're not going to be turning to this other passage that I'm referencing right now, if we were to also look in John's Gospel first, we would see that Jesus and Peter had met at least once before this passage that we are going to read today, when Andrew, which was Peter's brother, had brought him to Christ. In fact, I want us to understand that the man's name was actually Simon, not Peter. And it was in this first encounter that we see in John's Gospel that Jesus renames him Cephas, or Peter, which literally means a rock. And that's important, but we're going to come back to it a little bit later. But in our passage today, these two men, Simon, who is also known as Peter, and Christ, are going to meet up again for at least a second time. And Jesus is going to use Simon's boat as sort of a floating pulpit, so to speak, a place where he can preach from. And then a miracle is going to take place right after this. So let's take a look and see what happens, because I want us to look at the miracle, at Peter's reaction to the miracle, and then Christ's response, and most importantly, his reassurance to him. So it's Luke chapter 5, and I'm going to read the first 11 verses. It says, "So it was as the multitude pressed about him," and that's Jesus, "to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, and saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, 'Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch.' But Simon answered and said to him, 'Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net.' When they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and to help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, 'Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord.' For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, 'Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men.' So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him." Actually, I'm going to get right into our second text here before I put my Bible down. I just have one verse for that text, something that the Apostle Paul had to say to the church in Corinth, something that I think that we all need reminded of from time to time, and that's what I want to do today, remind all of us, but especially the men on this Father's Day. And so that text is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and it's just verse 58. And this is what Paul said. "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." I love that verse. Paul says, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. And then the hardest part of that verse, at least I think sometimes for us men, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Or there is a point. It is accomplishing something, whether you think you see it or not. And my question to all of us today would be, how often do you feel like your labor in something has been in vain? I think we've all been there at one point or another. We might be there right now. I know that I have been there. There have been times that I felt like no matter what I've done, that I'm just failing at it, that I'm not good enough for the challenge. In fact, as I was preparing for this Father's Day message this past week, I was also thinking a lot about my time spent working in the juvenile detention centers before becoming a preacher. And I was thinking about how I viewed myself then as kind of like a father figure to these kids, mainly because I knew some of the other officers that I worked with didn't care. Some did, but some didn't. And some of these kids, I knew that I was also one of the only positive male influences that they had in their life. They didn't have a dad at home. Sometimes if they did, maybe he had done something to hurt them. So I took it upon myself to be kind of firm with them, but fair, as I thought a dad should be. And I literally viewed my interactions with them in this kind of light. And that was an interesting and also very fulfilling period of my life. When I look back on it now, I can look back on it and feel fulfilled, although I didn't always find it so fulfilling while I was in the midst of it, in the labor, so to speak. In fact, most of the time, I probably felt like my labor was in vain, that I was kind of failing at what I was trying to do. I remember one stressful day in particular. I was thinking about this when I was writing the sermon, where I truly questioned this. I was the supervisor that day, and I was supervising the shift, and I It started off easy enough. I thought it was going to be a quiet day, and all I really wanted to do that afternoon was just kind of sit in the control center, watch the staff and the youth, and sit there and eat my lunch and have an easy day. I wasn't in the mood for any type of nonsense. I just wanted to get through the shift and go home. You know something? I tried to eat that lunch about 3 or 4 times that day and was never successful. Because every time I would raise that sandwich up to my mouth to take a bite, like clockwork, some crisis would take place in that moment. A crisis reminding me that I really had no control over the situation. First, it was a call from the facility nurse. She was asking me to come see her, so I put down my lunch. I went down to go see her, and she told me that a youth that had received court permission to be taken from the jail to a doctor's appointment by his mother without officer escort was still not back, and he should have been back about 2 hours before at this point. So I had to start making some phone calls to his probation officer, among others, and filling out all sorts of reports that take a lot of time, trying to figure out where this kid was. And then once I was kind of finished that and kind of put it in somebody else's hands, I sat back down. As I went to take the second bite, the fire alarm in the facility went off. And the siren was blaring and the strobe lights were going off, and I was standing up and I was looking at the control center and I was trying to figure out where the problem was, and then I was radioed that it went off in one of the cell blocks because one of the kids had intentionally popped a sprinkler head in his cell and was flooding it just because he wanted to make life on the officers hard that day. So I had to go down to that cell block, and we had to restrain him in the water and get all uncomfortable, take him to isolation, and then I had to deal with the fire department because they had to come, and they had to come in and inspect everything, and then I had to get maintenance on the line so that they could come fix the sprinkler head, and once again I had to write all kinds of reports. So I get back up there to my lunch again, and I just sat down when across the radio the nurse asked me to come see her again. You see, the missing youth had finally come back, and because he'd been gone so long, she asked my permission when he came back to drug test him, and when she did it, it came back dirty for multiple things, showing that his mother had taken him to a few more places other than the doctor's. I think I threw my lunch away at this point. I don't really remember, but all I know is that I kind of threw my hands up in the air because the rest of the shift was going to be spent with me dealing with POs and being buried in all sorts of statements and reports, and with kids that just would not learn their lesson. And it was days like that one where I felt like my labor was in vain, that I wasn't making that difference. I mean, it didn't matter how much of a positive influence I tried to be on those kids. It was a waste of time. Why was I doing it? And on top of it, days like that, I certainly didn't feel equipped to deal with the constant barrage of challenges that come our way. I was always second-guessing myself. But you know, my point is we don't always see the fruit of our labors immediately, especially during the fire. And something happened once that helped to change my perspective on this and helped me to see it from a different angle. In fact, what I'm referring to now kind of took place during that transition period in between my move from New Mexico back to Ohio. I was telling you about this move a little bit in my sermon last week. And I think this is why I was thinking about it this week. But you see, I had completed my last shift at the jail down in Farmington, and I had packed up all of my belongings into my Jeep, and I pointed the car east for that long ride back home. But I stopped at a gas station just out on the edge of town to fill up before leaving. And as I was standing there, holding on to the pump handle, almost finished, I saw the front doors of the building open up out of the corner of my eye. And then I heard a familiar voice say Jackson, as one of the biggest troublemakers that I had dealt with in the jail to that point started walking directly towards me. One that I had been very strict with because of his very bad behavior, and one, to be honest, I would have been fine never seeing again. And I began to think to myself, this is the last thing I need right now. I don't want trouble when I'm almost gone. I mean, I'm seconds away from leaving town, leaving this state. Why did I have to stop at this particular gas station? Well, as he got closer to me, the look on his face turned from a frown into a smile, and then the next thing I knew, he lifted up his hand and stretched it out to shake mine. So I grabbed it, and we awkwardly talked for a few moments. He acknowledged that my car was full of stuff. I said I was moving and leaving town, and he said to me, well, I'm glad I ran into you. He said, I've been doing a lot of thinking since being released, and you may not know this, but you had a major impact on my life during my time in jail. And you helped me to decide to turn it all around when I got out. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that, and thank you for all that you did. Well, you probably had to pick my jaw up from the ground at this point, because that was the last thing I expected from this encounter. I actually expected a physical alteration because of some experiences I had with this kid. But it stuck with me. And it stuck with me because I thought the opposite was true. I had given up on him, to be honest, quit kind of, because I thought that my labor with him had been in vain, and he was one of the many kids that I dealt with that made me question if I was able to do the job at all. And boy, have I questioned that thought in my life, and I think we all do. You know, no matter what the job or the situation was or is, I question it to this day about being a husband, being a father, even being a minister. Can I do the job? Am I failing? In fact, you know, I'll never forget the day that Shelley and I went in for the ultrasound, the very first ultrasound for our first child, to find out the sex of that baby. And we were sitting in that room that day, and the lady showed us the pictures, and she was asking us to guess what we thought it was going to be. And then after she was done with that little game, she finally told us that it was going to be a girl. Well, this was almost like a gut punch to me. Don't get me wrong, it's not because I didn't want a girl or that I would love her any less than a boy. That wasn't it at all. But it was because of fear. I mean, I was terrified enough in that moment as it was at the prospect of raising a boy, even in this crazy world that we live in. But a girl was a whole new set of worries altogether. So I kind of panicked inside, thinking, I can't do this. I'm going to fail her. And we were in the car on the ride home, and Shelley was just beaming, and she's talking about names and how cute this baby was going to be, and dresses and pigtails and all that stuff. And meanwhile, I was sitting there very quiet, thinking to myself how I was going to protect her from all of the evil around us in this world. Literally worried. And then my mind started going to all sorts of things. It actually went decades ahead when she might start to be interested in boys. And worse than that, then I started thinking about when boys might be interested in her. And that really worried me. So then I thought about buying my first gun. I even joked that we might switch and become Catholic so I could stick her in a convent at the time. And I was so zoned out in my serious thought of worry of failing to protect her, looking straight ahead, that Shelley got upset thinking that I was just disappointed that we were going to have a girl instead of a boy. But I wasn't disappointed. The truth was, I was just scared. And I was scared because I didn't feel worthy of the task set before us. And I think that even though we men, we put up a hard outward shell that makes people think otherwise, most don't realize just how little we actually do think of ourselves sometimes and our abilities. And that's the story of the call of Peter as well. A man who did not feel worthy of what he was being called to do. Now, Peter was a professional fisherman, and he had been out in those waters all night long before this particular encounter with Christ took place. And he had caught nothing, the Bible said. And then Jesus shows up, and he uses Peter's boat to preach and to teach the multitudes. And after he's done, he turns to Peter and he says to him, after Peter's probably exhausted, ready to go home and go to bed, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. Now, you can actually almost hear the physical exhaustion in Peter's reply when he says, Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. But yet, because of his great respect for Jesus, he says, nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. Probably expecting the same results. Failure for that evening. But then the Bible says that when he does this, when he obeys Christ, that he catches so many fish that the net starts to break. Obviously, this was not normal. Obviously, Christ was behind this. And so when Peter sees this miracle after being out all night and catching nothing on his own, and now these boats are full and they're sinking, he recognizes something. Something not only about Jesus, but about himself as well. You see, there is some symbolism going on here. Symbolism that was not lost on Peter, I'll say, because when he was out all that night fishing and catching nothing, that kind of represented something about his life, who he was. You see, on his own, that is who Peter was. Sometimes a failure. A man who wasn't quite good enough for the challenges that came his way every time they came. Sure he won some, sure he lost some. And I'm not talking about fishing, but I'm sure that Peter was an excellent fisherman. I mean, that was his career, it was his life. I'm just talking about what it means to be your average, everyday human being. Just like the rest of us, I'm sure there were days that Peter succeeded on his own, but also many other days where Peter failed at almost everything that day because he made the wrong choices. He caved into selfishness, was tired, you name it. just like all the rest of us do. And because of that, he felt like he wasn't good enough to do the Lord's work. And that's true. And on his own, he wasn't. On our own, neither are we. And so that's when you get the feeling of just wanting to give up. Why do something you know you're going to fail at? But now here Jesus was with him in the boat. And Christ knew that he had this rough night fishing, just like he knew all of the other personal flaws in Peter's life. But yet he was also calling this man to now work for him. And so he says, Peter, go back out and do it again. But this time, do it my way. And church, that's what I love about our God, that he truly is a God of second chances. You failed. So what? Every human being except Christ has. Get out there, do it again, and you know something? If he weren't a God of second chances, I know that I myself would have been lost a long time ago. So would Peter, and so would each and every one that's sitting here today. But you see, Christ was saying to him that day, I know that you failed on your own, but get back out there with me by your side, do what I say, and see what happens. Because I'm calling you to something new, something that we will do together. And so he does. And with the Son of God guiding him, not only does he succeed, but he goes beyond expectations. But this is where Peter really feels the contrast. This is where he sees how unworthy he truly is for this call because of how much he does fail on his own and how imperfect he is compared to Christ. And so he falls down on his knees and he says to Jesus, depart from me because I'm a sinful man. I can't do this, Lord. He doesn't want to mess this thing up, so he's rather be a quitter. But Christ's next word are what are so important. He looks down at this man that recognizes how on his own he's not good enough. And he says to him, do not be afraid, Peter. Now that's powerful. But he doesn't end it there either. He gives him the call next. He says, from now on, you will catch men. Or Peter, I've got a job for you to do anyway. And guess what? You don't need to quit. And you're not going to be a failure at it because I'm going to be there with you the whole time. And although there will still be days where you're going to feel like you aren't good enough, days where things look like you're failing and you're spinning your wheels and getting nowhere and that your works are in vain, do not give up. In fact, that's when I want you to be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in my work, and you won't fail because I will be right there. In other words, walk by faith, Peter, not by sight. And that's also why Jesus changed his name from Simon, which means he listens, to Peter, which means a rock. Because with Christ, he truly would become the immovable, steadfast man that he was designed to be by God. You see, church, God calls imperfect men and imperfect women for his perfect work, and then he equips them perfectly with his presence. And the same is absolutely 100% true for ladies as it is for men, but today's Father's Day, and men, I want you to know that no matter where you are in your journey of life, whether you are husbands, fathers, grandfathers, or even none of the above, God has still given you a call to influence others, just like he did Peter. Whether it's your family, coworkers, somebody else, the influence is there. Other people are watching and they're learning, whether you realize that they are or not. And you like Peter are going to often look at that responsibility and you're going to compare yourself to the perfection of Christ, know your own flaws, and then question your credentials for the job because you will recognize that you fall very short on your own. Like I did when I found out that I was going to be responsible for a brand new baby girl. I was like, I can't do this on my own. Likewise, how I felt with those troubled kids at the jail, like I just wasn't cut out to handle that responsibility. And you're going to even be terrified and sometimes say to God, Lord, take this from me. I know that I will fail at this. Just give it to somebody else. And sometimes you'll even just want to quit, saying, I don't have what it takes. And you'll think that because there will be days where things are going to look beyond your control, like they did for me that day. The whole jail seemed to blow up at once. But it's in those moments that you need to be that rock. And in those moments, you need to remember the words of Christ to not be afraid. I am the one that called you to this, and I will be with you every step of the way, he's saying. And something else, even when it still feels like you are failing, You probably don't even know the impact that you're actually having when you choose to be steadfast and immovable and like a rock in the work that God is calling you to do and to not quit. I mean, if I hadn't stopped to get gas that night before leaving Farmington, New Mexico, I never would have known the impact that I had on that young man's life. That I showed him a stability, something that he ended up desiring for himself, but I would not have known that. I would have always thought that I failed him. So men, I want you to hear me this morning when I say this. I don't care what's going on in your life. Don't quit. Don't ever give up. Realize your flaws like Peter, yes, and be humble. Because we all, men and women alike, have those flaws, but also recognize that you don't have anything to fear because you can do all things through Christ, who is going to be right there in the boat with you and who gives you your strength to make you that rock. Yes, it may seem overwhelming at times. I mean, I look at the mess that this world is in today, and it's very discouraging, and I wonder what difference can I truly make in it. But I'll tell you what this world and your children and your wives and everybody else that you influence don't need. They don't need quitters. They don't need men who say, I don't see the point. So they just join in and make a bad situation already worse. They need steadfast, immovable men. They need that rock, ones who will lead, always abounding in the work of the Lord through the strength of the one who now lives inside of us as believers, the very Holy Spirit of God. And if you're a Christian, then Christ is in that boat with you, and that is all the perfection that you will need to cover up your flaws. In fact, if Jesus used 12 very flawed men, imperfect fishermen, and tax collectors to literally turn this world upside down with an influence that is still felt to this day, 2,000 years later, then there's no telling what he will use you for as well if you don't quit. And men, I pray that you don't, your wives, children, grandchildren, friends, coworkers, this world need the influence of you. They need the influence of someone who knows their flaws, but who also knows that if he does things Christ's way, he's not going to fail. And so I'll close with this. Don't worry about what the world might have to say about you or the mistakes that you've publicly or privately made in the past, because Jesus knows those mistakes too. In fact, he knows them better in detail than anyone else, including you. And yet, the amazing thing is he's still telling you not to be afraid, because he's still calling you for his work that still needs to be done. He's still calling you for the job. So the question is, what will our answer be? If you will, bow your heads.